we are going to ask for the opening remarks.
Greetings, I'm Deputy Minister for Policy. It's good to see you, Minister. We see Mr. Januzi, Mr. Wit, Dr. Kim. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you everyone for coming to the North Korean experts discussion. I understand that we are going through a difficult time, so I especially thank you for joining us. And since this is going to be conducted online, I also welcome everyone joining us online. This year, as everyone would know, and we are going through the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of difficulties in the inter-Korean relations, US-DPRK relations, and the Korean Peninsula issues has been in a state of lull after the Hanoi summit in 2019. And we don't see an exit way at this point, but after the US presidential election, we believe that this has made a turning point for us to possibly break through this deadlock and seek new solutions on the Korean Peninsula. And it is a time for us to seek for that solution. And so on one hand, as we have continuation of difficulties with the deadlock of situations, this is also a time of opportunity. And in this time, we should really think of the policy of North Korea with experts, with the leading experts on how the upcoming administration should set its direction for its North Korean policy and also make recommendations to the incoming administration. And for us to seek ways to coordinate that, I believe that it is a great task for us. And I hope constructive resolutions to be made through this time, and for us to really grasp onto that opportunity and open up a new future for the Korean Peninsula. And so today, I again extend my gratitude to the experts on both Korea and the US side so that you can help us share your insight and your wisdom. We will listen to you intently and seek to open the path of the future of the Korean Peninsula with the US and DPRK for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Moderation. Hello, good morning and good evening, maybe. I'm Ji-young Kim, working as a professor at the Institute for Unification Education in the Ministry of Unification. It is my honor to join this global virtual discussion with the US and Korea's expert on North Korea and Korean Peninsula. In 2020, most governments of the world is experiencing difficult time for responding to COVID-19 pandemic situation and its economic effect. Because of this COVID-19, both inter-Korean relations and the US-DPRK relations in terms of negotiation on denuclearization in North Korea have been suspended. Furthermore, following the US presidential election, the situation surrounding the Korean Peninsula is likely to change as the next President Biden addressed that new administration will take different approach to North Korea. So in line with this transitional period, the Ministry of Unification have invited scholars and experts on North Korean Peninsula from the United States and South Korea to suggest how the next US administration should approach North Korea to settle peace on the Korean Peninsula, and also how the ROK and the US should coordinate their policy toward North Korea. I hope this seminar contributed to finding a way of denuclearization and construction of the peace on the Korean Peninsula. Before we begin the discussion, I would like to introduce panels. The first panel is Professor Kiman Cho, and he is a professor of Unification Department at the Inje University and was a former unification minister in South Korea. The second panel is Mr. Frank Januzi. He is the president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The last discussant is Mr. Joel. He is a senior fellow of Steeman Centers and director of 38 North website. Thank you for joining to this seminar. Before we Q&A session, I would like you have some 5 to 10 minutes time to speak about the suggestion for the next US administration policy toward North Korea and ROK-US coordination on North Korean policy. This is kind of a theme of this session. So shall we start Mr. Joel Wit with this comment?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the invitation to speak today. And I think, as many of us know, there have been a lot of meetings speculating about what President-elect Biden's policy on North Korea will do and what it should be. And I'm going to try not to repeat the standard wisdom because I think a lot of it is off the mark. And so what I'd like to do is address 5 key issues very quickly because I know, we have limited time. First, there's the issue of will President-elect Biden tackle the North Korean challenge quickly or not? There's a standard wisdom out there that, of course, President-elect Biden has a lot of issues to deal with. Domestic issues, international problems, all of that is true. But the conclusion that a lot of people reach that the new administration may not turn quickly to North Korea, I think may not be true. And the problem here is we shouldn't lump the issue of North Korea in that vast universe of domestic and foreign problems. We should think of it as part of the nuclear diplomacy agenda for the United States. And there are 3 problems on that agenda. There's Iran, there's nuclear arms reduction with Russia, and there's North Korea. So I don't know if you've been following the news, but the Iran deal that was ditched by President Trump seems to be on the way towards resurrection. In terms of nuclear arms reduction, there's a strategic arms reduction deal with Russia that's due to be renewed in February. That seems to likely get quick attention, and I think the Russians will agree. So that leaves the nuclear diplomacy agenda open for North Korea. So I think that at least will allow the administration to turn to the issue quickly. The other big issue, of course, many people have talked about is strategic patience. Will a Biden administration repeat the Obama approach? I've been working on a book about the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and North Korea, and I've interviewed a lot of these people. I think there's still that inclination, but I think there is also a recognition among very senior people that strategic patience was a failure, and they don't want to repeat that again. So that's encouraging. Second, will North Korea launch a missile soon? There's been a lot of speculation about that. Standard wisdom is, well, history shows us that they take these kinds of steps early in new administrations. I think that's a wrong reading of history. They certainly did it when President Obama took office, but let's recognize the special circumstances. That was because Kim Jong-il had had a stroke, and North Korea was putting up its defenses against anyone trying to interfere in its internal affairs. The Trump administration, there was a short-range missile launch early on, but that was in reaction to US ROK winter exercises. Those exercises have been toned down now because of the Trump administration policy. So I think it's impossible to say, based on a reading of history, that they are going to do something early in the Biden administration. And on top of that, their internal problems may work against that. The problem of dealing with the virus and everything else that's going on around that. Third, there is this idea out there, this debate, I guess, about should we focus on arms control or denuclearization? And there's a lot of Americans saying, let's do arms control and forget about denuclearization. I think that's just kind of, quite frankly, silly. We should be doing both. And by both, I mean denuclearization starts with arms control, moves on to arms reduction, and finally denuclearization. And even the North Koreans are willing to accept that notion. So I think everyone can agree, except maybe John Bolton, that this is a long-term objective. Fourth, should we seek to freeze North Korea's nuclear program right away? There's a standard wisdom, at least at one US think tank that recently did a study of this, that we should stop production of fissile material right away. I say no, that's not achievable, and it's not our most pressing priority. Our most pressing priority in any denuclearization talks will be to stop North Korea's development of ICBMs and hydrogen bombs. And that means tighter restrictions on testing, plus getting a handle on the Yonbyon facility, where there are critical materials for hydrogen bombs produced. That heads off the threat to the United States, and I understand it doesn't head off the threat to South Korea, but it's important for South Korean defense. And that is because if North Korea continues down the road it's been on, it will threaten extended deterrence, the nuclear umbrella over South Korea. And if that happens, it could lead to a regional nuclear arms race. Last point I want to make, there's a discussion out there about should we pursue a multilateral approach in dealing with North Korea? Standard wisdom is yes. Of course, we need South Korea, we need Japan, we need China and Russia. I say no, we don't need all of those countries, but let me offer an explanation. I think South Korea and the United States should be front and center in this process, working together. I think Japan should be consulted, but I don't see the Japanese as an important part of the solution. And let's be honest, for years, Japan's policy towards North Korea has been dominated by getting back their abductees to the exclusion of all other issues. I understand that, but we can't let that get in the way of what we're doing. And finally, I don't think China is central either. If there's anything we've learned from 25 years of trying to solve this problem, it's been that we shouldn't depend on China to help us out. They should be consulted, they should be informed, but I don't hold out any hopes that they'll be actively helpful. And I think the best we can hope for is that they will not be harmful. So why don't I stop there? And of course, we'll have a discussion about specific policy issues. So I look forward to that.
Thank you very much for your speech. You emphasized 5 points actually from Biden administration's approach in the beginning of administration and the North Koreans' approach to new administration. And lastly, you mentioned about multilateral approach to North Korean issue comparing with bilateral approach. So the next speech, shall I ask Mr. Frank Januzi?
Thank you so much, Ji-young. It's my pleasure to join you this morning in Seoul and from Baltimore, Maryland, where it's evening. And I really appreciate this invitation to speak to an important topic at an important time. I agree with most of what Joel said, and where I disagree I will make it clear toward the end when it comes to multilateralism and bilateralism. I don't have a big disagreement, but maybe a slightly different way to frame the role of the external parties to the crux of the matter, which I very much agree with Joel, is between the United States and the DPRK, and of course with South Korea very much also at the center. So since I agree with so much of what Joel said, let me offer up just a few additional thoughts about what I believe to be the important unresolved ambiguities that have been with us for a long time on the Korean Peninsula. Some of those ambiguities are there by design, but some of them no longer serve a diplomatic purpose, and I think need to be gradually clarified if we're going to make progress on a roadmap toward peace and denuclearization. And there are three sort of principal areas of lack of clarity where we need more clarity. Maybe not perfect clarity, but more clarity. And the first of these is on the definition of denuclearization. It is variously described as denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear programs, denuclearization of North Korea. But the Singapore Declaration language that we're going to work toward a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is not quite the same as the joint statement six-party talks objective defined in the multilateral talks in 2005. And some of this is by design by the diplomats because it was not certain in 2005, for instance, whether the goals of the 1992 denuclearization North-South agreement, which had 8 no's, 8 proscribed, prohibited activities, whether those goals could really be realized, whether all 8 of them could be realized. And so it was sort of left a bit vague. Well, now, more than 20 years since the 1992, almost 30 years since the 1992 agreement, and 15 years since the joint statement, we need to do a better job defining the objective. Second thing that needs to be defined is the peace regime or the peace mechanism, the peace process. What are we talking about here? Is this a declaration to end the war? Is it a step-by-step reciprocal process of confidence and security building? Is it a peace treaty? Is it all of the above? What is clear is that there must be peace, but how one defines it, what the end goals are, is not clear. And as a veteran of staffing in the US Senate, I can tell you that when people start talking about a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula, I get very worried because to get 67 senators to agree to anything, even to peace, is quite a challenge in Washington on a good day. And then the third item that I think needs to be addressed is the security concerns of the DPRK. These are integral to the question of denuclearization and peace, but the positive assurances that are to be provided to the DPRK as part of a denuclearization agreement and a peace agreement also remain vague. What kind of positive assurances, what kind of security guarantees will the North demand? So I mention these three ambiguities because I believe that the Biden administration intends to pick up from three fundamental documents as they try to fashion their approach to North Korea. The first is the Jo Myung-nak Clinton joint statement, which does a pretty good job, I think, of describing peace. The second is the September 19th joint statement from the six-party talks, which I believe to be probably the most comprehensive description of denuclearization. And the third is the Singapore Declaration, which does a pretty good job of trying to affirm that both parties will abandon their hostility toward one another. But apart from that, is frankly exceptionally vague and doesn't provide enough of a framework to devise a step-by-step reciprocal roadmap. And so I would hope that the Biden administration early on, and I agree with Joel, it's not going to take a long time for them to get ready. I would hope that early on they would begin to grapple with these three ambiguities, consulting with South Korea and China on how to make them a bit less ambiguous, and then going to the North Koreans for what I hope will be sustained working level talks designed to get back to the table so that we can actually make progress on the vague but important commitments that were made in Singapore. Final point, just where I differ a bit with Joel, I believe that the six-party talks were always essentially a facade. They were an umbrella under which the U.S. and the DPRK could talk. Wu Dawei would sort of welcome the Americans and the North Koreans to Beijing, and then he would say, "Okay, now we've convened. The two of you need to go in the back room and start to talk." And Kim Gae-gwan and whoever was representing the U.S. would sort of, would get to it. I think that while it is true, while I agree with Joel that China's role has not always been constructive, and in the current situation is judged by some even to be pernicious, I don't think we can escape China's role in all of this. They're going to be party to any peace and any denuclearization agreement at the end of the day. They're going to be an important guarantor addressing the needs of the DPRK for security. And I think that there could be value, therefore, in reconvening some multilateral umbrella under which the US and the DPRK, as the two who really must find a key to unlock the nuclear puzzle, parties can meet. But that's really more about, form rather than substance. And I also don't think that that should come to the exception of bilateral talks. I think there can be both. But I think at some point you need a multilateral guarantee. It's a bit like being at a wedding ceremony where you need to have witnesses to affirm the vows that are being made and to promise to uphold the couple in their vows and to help them keep their vows. I want China, Russia, Japan in the room saying, yes, we're going to support this and we endorse it. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. You actually, Mr. Januzi, emphasized three unreserved ambiguity, including lack of clarity about definition of the denuclearization, etc., and the security concern of North Korea, etc. And also you mentioned about disagreement about the multilateral approach with Mr. Wit. Probably we can discuss about this multilateralism or bilateralism deal with North Korea later. And shall I ask Professor Kiman Cho your speech?
Yeah. All right, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be meeting you. So, Mr. Joel Wit, it's been a long time. And also, Mr. Januzi, it's great to see you. Now, for quite a long time, we have been having very close discussions. So now I do agree with most of what has been said so far. But given the importance of this current juncture, I would like to take a deeper dive into the situation. And I believe that we also need to have more in-depth discussion on some issues. Now then, I would just like to add my comments to the two speakers' discussion so far. Yes, so even after Biden administration is inaugurated, the North Korean issue will be important, and then also in terms of the yes, the Biden administration would have to focus on the domestic issues first. So where does that leave the North Korean issue is a big question at this point. But then now for us, one big concern is that now the North Korean issue, it actually comes down to rebuilding trust. And it is very important that in the beginning of an administration that we seize the opportunity to rebuild trust. So that would be one way of approaching this issue, which is very complex and difficult, but that would be one way of putting this on track for another round of dialogue. So again, I would like to emphasize the importance of trust at this point. Now, the North Korean nuclear issue has been around for 30 years now. But then in the past 30 years of experience, what are the lessons have we learned? And I would say that in that context, three things are important. First, I believe that comprehensive approach is very important. So for denuclearization and peace process, and also economic prosperity with lesser economic sanctions, so I would say that striking a balance between these three pursuits would still be very important. And second is a phase-by-phase approach. So Mr. Januzi also mentioned this, but there would be the ultimate goal. And then the question is, how do we get to that end from where we are today? Then that means that we have to divide that path into different phases. But now at this time, we see that the North Korean nuclear program is too sophisticated, so we need to avoid dividing up the phases too finely, meaning that we need to limit the number of phases to make sure that we can speed things up. So I would say that that probably is the biggest challenge given to us. So if we are to define the principles in a bigger picture, then I believe that that would enable us to dish out on the details. And then now regarding the multilateral approach, now Mr. Joel Wit, so I do understand where you're coming from, because yes, we have tried the six-party talk, but then it really came down to how serious North Korea and the US war in the dialogue and the negotiations. So we have all experienced that, so I'm sure that we all understand that. But then I would also like to point out some of the differences of today. So in terms of China's role, no matter how we see it, the China-North Korea relations, so I would say that their bilateral relations have become much tighter than before, not only economically but also politically and militarily. We see that their relations are much stronger and tighter than before, so we do need to take that into consideration. And for myself, now, yes, I have. So for the six-party talks as well, I mean, we have gone through this experience, but again, the six-party talks, this is about enabling the two parties, North Korea and the US, to have a good talk, and for the other parties to support them and help them out to facilitate the discussion. And then now, with the impending Biden administration, and also how the Biden administration is going to focus or not focus on North Korean issues. So if the situation is that the Biden administration cannot place priority on the North Korean issue at this point, then we would perhaps need to gain support from other countries as well. So for that, I would actually like to propose a four-party talk. So for both the denuclearization and also for the Korean Peninsula regime, so the parties, so whether it's the end of war declaration or whatever, so because the parties involved are the four parties, so I do believe that at least a four-party talk would be necessary. And once this is well established and running, then we can perhaps broaden this to six-party talk. Because the denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula, is inevitably linked to security and peace on the Northeast Asia. So yes, my idea is to start with a four-party talk and eventually broaden this to a six-party talk.
For your comments, actually, former Minister Kiman Cho emphasized three ways about the comprehensive approaches. The second of all, step-by-step approach. The last of all, he emphasized the high capability of North Korean nuclear weapons. And also, he mentioned about the importance of multilateral approach to North Korea. And then he emphasizing probably we can start with four-party talk, and then we can transit to six-party talk lastly. So actually, I prepared many questions about these discussions, but can we just start multilateral approach and bilateral approach, because you have a disagreement, Mr. Januzi and Mr. Joel Wit. So shall I just ask Mr. Joel Wit to respond to Mr. Januzi's argument?
Sure. Sure, I'd be happy to. I think there's less here than meets the eye in terms of a disagreement. But let me describe to you the process I think is ideal. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think that the United States, working with South Korea, has to start quickly to engage North Korea. And I'm not just talking about working level talks. I think if the opportunity arises, the US should be more than willing to send a senior official to Pyongyang to have meetings there to kickstart serious bilateral negotiations, and also use that to help kickstart inter-Korean talks as well. So I see the US as leading the charge in a serious way. And in that process, of course, we work very closely with South Korea. We consult with Japan, but I'm not willing to just, hang back because the Japanese have some misgivings about what we're doing. We consult with China, of course, but once again, we move forward. We consult and we move forward. And Russia too. We consult, but we move forward. If the process moves forward, yes, in the context of serious US-North Korean talks, serious North-South talks, there are going to be opportunities for multilateral meetings. Like, for example, the minister's idea about four-party talks. I would see those more as focused on a peace process. And even a six-party talk, occasionally all six parties get together in Beijing, consult, discuss issues. But beyond that, I don't see it as a main negotiating forum. So that's my vision, at least, of how we should proceed.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to these comments? Mr. Januzi, yes?
Just briefly, Joel has more direct experience in support of the negotiations than I have. And I find that very often those who have sat through the six-party process, have an understandable reluctance to allow a kind of a slow dance to stand in the way of the immediacy that this problem calls for. So I want to endorse what Joel is saying in terms of a sense of urgency that needs to drive the diplomacy. It's not just a question of timing, with the Moon Jae-in presidency only having whatever it is, 18 months or so, but it's also, frankly, the fact that the North Korean nuclear program continues to develop day by day, and there's no time to be wasted in trying to put a stop to it. So I certainly don't think that the first step should be like trying to convene a six-party talk. I would agree with Joel. And I think that there is a role for multilateralism as a kind of a guarantor and as a regional support network for a deal that ultimately needs to be struck between the US and DPRK, with the US acting after close consultation and in close partnership always with Seoul. So I agree with Joel. There's not as much of a difference there as may have been perceived at first blush. But I do think that at the end of the day, the United States cannot devise a strategy for the Korean Peninsula that doesn't take Chinese equities into account. Because if we do that, we will regret it. Because the Chinese can be a bad actor, and they can undermine anything that we're trying to accomplish if they're not involved and integrated into the process at an appropriate stage.
Thank you. Probably both of you have a different idea about the timing of a multilateral approach and also kind of a different way. Former Minister Kim, would you like to comment, have a comment on these discussion issues, or should I just move to next subject?
예, 지금
Yes, the most important thing today is not form, but to swiftly resume this negotiation. And that is where the focus should be on. As Mr. Wit said, the Biden administration, if the Biden administration can swiftly begin bilateral negotiation, then I believe that that is a good option. However, as we all know, as soon as the Biden administration starts, we do not anticipate for the administration to specifically engage in the US-DPRK talks because of a lot of difficulties embedded in other issues. So there should be roles taken by Korea and China in that process.
I think we can move on to the Biden administration's approach to North Korea in the beginning of the administration. Actually, Mr. Joel Wit emphasized probably Biden administration in the beginning, probably they can send a senior officer to North Korea to have a discussion or restart negotiation on denuclearization. But many experts and South Korean people are concerning about probably Biden administration, we're going to have a very busy time to solve out domestic issues like COVID-19 and economic recovery, and also Iranian issues, etc., etc. But Mr. Joel Wit and Mr. Januzi have a kind of a positive expectation on the returning of negotiation on denuclearization. So I would like to ask any kind of creative way to restart negotiation between North Korea and the United States, except that Mr. Joel Wit already mentioned, like sending senior officer to North Korea. Shall I ask Mr. Januzi first?
Sure, please, Frank.
Well, thank you, and I think that it will depend not just on what the U.S. wants to do, but what the DPRK will accept. I'm concerned that the COVID situation in DPRK has led them to a kind of a shutdown of contact across the board with Seoul, with Beijing, and I think with the United States as well. And so it may be necessary for the United States to use more than one channel to get things moving. Best would be, as Joel said, a senior representative of the administration who could engage in talks with counterparts from North Korea, perhaps at a neutral location. But in the absence of that, then we could try track 1.5, some kind of a back channel, semi-official talk to allow the parties to communicate with each other and sound each other out on the pathway forward. Both can work. But I think the key point is to avoid a delay. Delay really is our enemy here, not only because it will brew feelings of uncertainty in Pyongyang about the intentions of the Biden administration, but also, frankly, it gives them time for mischief that may have very little or might not even have a direct political motive. One of the lessons I have learned, and I know Joel has learned this as well by watching the Korean Peninsula for years, is that sometimes the DPRK will do something that can derail the prospects for diplomacy and do it for technical reasons or military development reasons that may not even have been fully intended as a political message. So I don't want to see the North testing submarine-launched ballistic missiles and having that interpreted in Washington as a great insult to the incoming Biden administration, when it may just be that the Navy is ready to test the submarine. I think we need to get moving on diplomacy right away.
Yeah, thank you. Probably we all agree we have to move forward on the negotiation. But the problem is how to restart this negotiation with North Korea. Mr. Januzi mentioned about North Korea's position at the moment. They have a difficult time of COVID-19, also economic problem as well. So based on this problem, I would like to ask Professor Kiman Cho, from the North Korean perspective, how do we restart with North Korea on denuclearization negotiation in the beginning of Biden administration?
Well, yes, as Mr. Januzi has mentioned, because of the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the resumption of negotiations. So it is true that yes, COVID has had an impact. So I would say that that factor has to be taken into account at this point. Having said that, the US and North Korea, so now let's say from the point of from the perspective of the US administration, if they were to resume dialogue with North Korea, I believe that they are capable of finding any channel or a mechanism. But what is important is to resume the negotiations, then we would have to review then and assess the Hanoi summit in June 2019. Now, for North Korea, I mean, their leader went all the way to Vietnam. And they also, of course, probably have come to the decision on their own process. So I believe that perhaps for that, they are not as flexible as we hope they would be. In other words, for the Hanoi summit, North Korea, now what they had said was that they would shut down the Yeonbyeon facilities and also get the easing of the sanctions in return. So that was the goal of North Korea. And then how we can expand that or how we can come up with a design that would allow that. So I would say that that would be the most important. But anyway, so since the failure of the Hanoi summit, then from the Trump administration, like for example Stephen Biegun or others, so they have also tried to have working level meeting with North Korea, but then North Korea has not budged from their basic position that was stated at the Hanoi summit, and because of that there was no progress made so far. So I believe that that has to be dealt with and addressed by the Biden administration for the negotiation to resume and to move forward.
Former minister emphasized the review.
Could I add a point here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean,
that's fine. You can continue. Yeah.
I agree with everything that my colleagues have said, and let me raise another possibility. I think Frank is absolutely right that North Korea right now is shut down. And we don't know when that's going to change. We don't know whether there will be alternative avenues for communication besides having diplomats meet somewhere. So in the meantime, I think what we can do is start a messaging strategy to the North Koreans. We can do it in private, but we can also do it in public. So let me mention one possibility. You know, when the for example, the Secretary of State designate will have to have hearings and be confirmed, and that'll probably happen, you know, in mid-January, maybe a little later than that. What will he say about North Korea? Well, you know, the North Koreans are going to be paying very close attention. So that's just one possibility for starting a concerted messaging strategy aimed at the North Koreans.
Okay, you mentioned the messaging strategy in the public and in terms of private and public terms. Let me ask you about the 1.5 think tank networking with North Korea. I think I watched some last interview of you mentioned about quite negative about that 1.5 meetings with North Korea. How do you think about that approach, Mr. Joel Wit?
I'm not sure how negative I was since I've done a lot of that, but you know, I think they can be useful under the right circumstances. So, for example, at the beginning of the Trump administration, the track 1.5 meetings were useful in starting to move the ball forward. So I think in theory it's possible, but once again, you got to be able to meet with people or at least communicate with them somehow. And right now, that's just not possible with the North Koreans. That could change, and in that case, sure, there might be a role for the right kinds of meetings with the right kind of people who have the right message.
Okay, thank you. Actually, yes, you mentioned about messaging strategy. So probably someone just argued probably Biden administration can support the Singapore summit joint statement. This is a kind of a way to restart negotiation or send a message to North Korea. How do you think about this kind of a strategy, Mr. Januzi?
Well, I'll be interested to hear both Minister Kim and Joel's thoughts about this as well. All of my friends in Seoul are anxious for the United States to affirm the Singapore Declaration. It is traditional for US presidents to abide by the solemn commitments undertaken by their predecessors in office. And one of the extraordinary things about Donald Trump's presidency was his withdrawal from the climate accords, his withdrawal from the INF Treaty, his withdrawal from TPP, and his 180-degree turn on so many important international commitments the United States had made. I certainly don't expect the Biden administration to do that. I think they will abide by important commitments, and they will restore commitments made by the Obama administration on climate and other issues. But when it comes to the Singapore Declaration, my personal view is that it's not enough only to reaffirm Singapore. Yes, the Biden administration should signal its support for the Singapore Declaration. But to me, the Singapore Declaration was frankly a step backwards in terms of not including as much as the North and South and the US had agreed to in previous agreements. So I would like the Biden administration to be perhaps a little more ambitious and say, well, of course, we stand by the Singapore Declaration, but we need to go further to build a really genuine, lasting, comprehensive peace and security mechanism for the Korean Peninsula. So I think they should signal early that yes, they will stand by it, but that they don't want to acknowledge that the Singapore Declaration by itself provides an adequate framework. I think they can be vague about it. I mean, I think they can phrase it in positive terms about how Singapore is a great starting place, but we need to do even more to build lasting peace and security on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you. Professor Kiman Cho, I would like to ask about that messaging strategy. How do you think about Mr. Joel Wit and Mr. Januzi's comments?
예, 저는
Well then, I do agree with what Mr. Januzi has just stated. So the Singapore Declaration was really about the principles, I believe that. So compared to the previous agreements, then in 2000, there was the joint communique between North Korea and the US, and then also the 2005, the joint declaration between the two Koreas, and so it is actually a little different from those two agreements. So of course, Mr. Janucci has mentioned this, but what I believe at this point is not just to reaffirm the principles, but to really talk about how we are going to get things done. So now we need to have an agreement on more of the practical matters and also implementation. So to that point, yes, I agree. But I also believe that there was also there has to be some political calculation. In other words, we would also have to consider what kind of impact this would have on North Korea. So if we are to take all those factors into consideration, then the Singaporean declaration in principle should be accepted, and then we can move forward from there to say that we need to have working level meetings in order to realize the Singaporean declaration.
Just probably we're going to have 28 minutes. So let's move to next subject. Let me just ask about the evaluation of Kim Jong-un's policy and actions toward the United States during the Trump administration. In particular, what do you think about the denuclearization negotiation with the United States during the Trump administration? Probably there is some different approach in comparing with previous regimes, Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung regimes. And then how do you expect in 2021 how North Korea is gonna do a policy towards or negotiation with North United States and South Korea? And shall I just ask you former Minister Kiman Cho first?
예,
Yes. On that point, as North Korea is preparing for its party congress in January, through this party congress, its domestic policy and foreign affairs policy framework will be announced. And overall, in a big framework, the way that we foresee it will be three points. First of all, this self-reliance slogan that North Korea is pursuing will be reaffirmed with COVID-19. The importance of disease prevention and control will be signaled alongside with self-reliance. Second is its strengthening of national defense. North Korea's national defense is not only about nuclear deterrence, not only about foreign affairs aspect, but there's also a domestic aspect of its national defense. So on its anniversary day of its party, Workers' Party, the military parade that it conducts at that time is a messaging to both home and abroad in this difficult economic times and COVID-19. By strengthening national defense, it gives assurance to the North Korean people, and its foreign affairs policy would center around DPRK-China relations as it engages with the US. Even now, it is going through a lot of problems in public health involving food shortage and so forth. So there's high possibility that it would rely on China for providing such assistance. And in the US-China hegemonic rivalry, China would also acknowledge and highly acknowledge its relations with North Korea. So with a close close China DPRK relations, and with that as a reference, North Korea would probably proactively seek concessions.
Is North Korea going to strengthen self-dependence policy and dependency on China, and also development of military capabilities? So how do you think about these comments on Mr. Joel Wit? Could you turn on your mic, Joel Wit?
I'd like to focus on something else. When you ask about North Korea and future negotiations, to me, it's sort of a black hole. I have no idea what approach they're going to take or what they might be interested in, and that's what talking to them is all about, trying to figure that out. But I think there's one big factor here that we need to consider very seriously, and that is the role of Kim Jong-un in future talks. I mean, my impression of some of the talks during the Trump administration was that he was the guy who had to do the negotiating. None of the negotiators were empowered to do anything on denuclearization. They could handle all the other issues: peace process, peace declaration, liaison offices, retrieving the remains of Americans. All of those issues the negotiators could handle, but he was the only person who could deal with nuclear issues. And so that, number one, tells us something about what the process may have to be with the North Koreans to figure out what their bottom line might be. But secondly, I've often wondered, what kind of experience does Kim Jong-un have negotiating with other leaders or other countries? That's another issue I think that's important. He doesn't seem to have very much. And the last issue that's important, it's an issue that every North Korean leader has had to address, is through agreeing to denuclearization, the price will be greater contact with the international community. Are they willing to take that risk? I think different leaders' calculations may be different, and I'm not sure what Kim Jong-un's calculation is.
Okay. Mr. Joel emphasized the role of Kim Jong-un, so what process they're going to take, and also probably you argued that Kim Jong-un doesn't have enough experience on negotiation with other countries, and also he doesn't have North Korean regime doesn't have any calculation of internet to contact the international organization in this pandemic crisis. So how do you think about this Kim Jong-un regime's behavior or policy toward United States during the Trump administration, Mr. Januzi?
Well, I wish I had any brilliant insights to offer about how Kim Jong-un is likely to engage with the Biden administration, but I really don't. It's as much of a mystery to me, I think, as it is to most of us. What we can learn, I think, from the approach that he took with Donald Trump is that, as Joel pointed out, decision-making in DPRK ultimately resides with Kim Jong-un. And he has not heretofore, and frankly, neither did his father, really empowered his diplomats with a lot of maneuvering room when it comes to negotiating the details or even the end state of denuclearization. So there's a lot of debate in the United States about top down, bottom up, and one of the, I think, correct innovations of the Trump administration was to try to catalyze the peace and denuclearization process through high-level engagement. But I also know Joe Biden pretty well. And I think that his instinct is going to be not to jump into high-level talks until he has a better sense of where the DPRK is headed. We touched briefly on the humanitarian issue. Let me say that in addition to, this is on a separate point, but in addition to the very good advice that Joel gave about Tony Blinken's confirmation hearing and other messaging opportunities, I think there's a messaging opportunity when it comes to COVID, because whether it's the president in his inaugural address talking about the need to work globally to address this pandemic on a purely humanitarian basis, and to especially help those countries that need the most help, or whether it's a more detailed statement about the role of humanitarian assistance in American foreign policy that might flow from Tony Blinken's confirmation hearing and other statements. I think it would be useful for the US to pay more attention to the human dimension of the Korean Peninsula challenge. And that could be an area where messaging could also be valuable to Kim Jong-un himself. So yeah, we're going to have to wait and see. There's a lot of mystery about how Kim Jong-un will approach the administration after Trump. I think he liked Donald Trump's audacity, but in the end, Donald Trump's failure to pay any attention to process was also, I think, his undoing.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask former Minister Kiman Cho. Probably they mentioned about the role of Kim Jong-un is very important, and you dealt with North Korea as a minister of unification. So how do you consider North Korea of Kim Jong-un regimes, and how do you predict in 2021? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so first of all, I would say that what I'm about to say is a little different from what has just been said by the two speakers so far. So now when it comes to North Korea for diplomacy or for other major issues, yes, it is the leaders' decisions that are the most important. So then it comes down to how we can draw out such decisions from the leader. That we have to think about how we can build up trust between the leaders and how to maintain such trust between the leaders. And I would say that that would probably key to resuming and maintaining negotiations. Now, having said that, from another perspective, then, now for the scope of denuclearization and also the content of the denuclearization and also the corresponding measures, so for example, the peace process on the Korean Peninsula or the easing of the sanctions. So for the host of other issues and also how to specifically approach them, I would say that we do need to have working level discussions. So on one hand, maintaining trust between the leaders, on the other hand, carrying out working level meetings, so how to strike a balance between these two. So I believe that it's not only about goodwill, but I believe that, or it's not about like what comes first, but I believe that they have to be conducted in parallel, in good balance. And just one more thing that I would like to comment on. Now for 2021, looking ahead to the North Korean economy. Now, the North Korean economy as it is today is struggling because with the economic sanctions starting some time ago, then the North Korean trade volume plummeted. Following that, the COVID-19 also affected North Korea. So, of course, all countries are currently trying to maintain health and economy at the same time. And likewise, in North Korea, they are maintaining very fine balance between health and economic growth. But despite such difficulties in their economy, for us to expect that North Korea then would be conceding a lot is something that we should not be hoping for, because past history tells us that when North Korea is actually driven into a corner, then the harder they might be determined to move towards self-reliance. So we should not be expecting that North Korea would be giving up a lot, and we have to focus more on how we are going to convince North Korea from a diplomatic perspective.
Probably we can move on to working level coordination regarding with South Korea's role. North Korea negotiation ahead of inter-Korean relation. In addition to this, the independent project of inter-Korean relations should be consulted in a way of Korea-US working group to make sure that inter-Korean relations should not go too far ahead of denuclearization negotiation during the Trump administration. So how does the Biden administration view the role of South Korea in the denuclearization of North Korea and peace on the Korean Peninsula in terms of working level coordination in the beginning of Biden administration? So how do you think about this role of South Korea in this period, Mr. Joel Wit?
Sorry, I'm not sure I have a lot to say about that. I mean, it's yes, okay. It's a given. Even under Trump, Steve Biegun worked very closely with your government, so it's a given. And having been through those talks, sometimes there are disagreements. Actually, often there are disagreements, but they're always worked out. So I'm not sure I have a lot to say about the current situation. The problem with those consultations comes if there's a new government, for example, in your country, that disagrees with the current approach. And the US government wants to continue to try to engage North Korea. Then there could be problems. But beyond that, I'm not sure I have much to add.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Janusz, how do you think about the role of South Korea?
Well, I agree with Joel that it's axiomatic, it's fundamental to any successful U.S. approach on the peninsula. It has to be centered first on consultation and preservation of the special relationship between the U.S. and ROK and rooted in the alliance. And I agree with Joel also that Steve Biegun, you know, he did a good job of trying very hard to stay on the same page with ROK. I think the area where there's a lot of room for improvement is on the military to military relationship, U.S. ROK and the special measures agreement and the negotiations over Korean host nation support. I think that this was needlessly complicated by the Trump administration. It's natural that there should be tough bargaining and sometimes disagreements, but there was almost an extortionist attitude taken by President Trump. And I think this reflects his underlying disdain for the complications of alliances. You know, this is something that President Trump has expressed for 40 years, deep reservations about American alliance relationships with NATO, with Japan, with Korea, and a reluctance to view these alliance relationships as assets I think in the Trump real estate world, these alliances are liabilities. They're distressed properties that should be sold, at a fire sale to get them off of his real estate listings. So I think that there will be a refreshing change with Biden, that he genuinely does value and treasure these alliances. But I also agree with Joel that that should not be a surprise. That should be normal.
Okay. Former Minister Kiman Cho, how do you think about the role of South Korea in the beginning of Biden administration?
Well, first of all, between Korea and the US, there are a lot of issues to be discussed. The methodology of denuclearization and corresponding measures should be discussed. For example, shutting down Yongbyon might be an important factor in a negotiation, and if so, then the cooperative CTR, seeing how CTR can be applied to Yongbyon, is something that Korea and the US could specifically discuss. And on that point, I believe sufficient discussion should happen. And another issue to be dealt with is regarding the end of war declaration and peace treaty. If these are to be propelled, then how will this relate to the ROK-US alliance? As Mr. Januzi said, in the US Senate, there are concerns of the peace treaty, and those concerns ultimately would affect the ROK-US alliance. And I believe that is the premise, that it will affect the ROK-US alliance, that there are worries. But yet, for us to achieve the goal of denuclearization, the end of war declaration and peace treaty should proceed. And so a true denuclearized Korean Peninsula, a Korean Peninsula regime on this peninsula, should have a future-oriented, future-looking ROK-US alliance. And on the ways to achieve this should be discussed not only between the officials, but also experts.
A comment. Probably this is going to be last question I'm going to address. The last question is there any possibility Biden administration just can let inter-Korean relations move forward to have a negotiation track with North Korea? Okay, shall I ask Mr. Januzi first?
Thanks. Well, I think the Korean Peninsula challenge is one that requires teamwork. And the reason it requires teamwork is because no matter how assiduously, no matter how diligently and faithfully South Korea pursues diplomacy with the DPRK, at the end of the day, if the Republic of Korea cannot deliver the United States in a peace agreement with the North, then the North will never feel secure in its position. So while the ROK, certainly to my mind, has a leading role to play in issues of peace and reconciliation and hopefully one day unification of the Korean Peninsula, it's the United States that is an essential player on the security puzzle. And DPRK will not denuclearize in the absence of a peace and denuclearization agreement with the United States. So my attitude about this is that, of course, the ROK should proceed and be given a broad latitude. The U.S. should not be in the business of trying to prevent the ROK from improving relations with the DPRK. But because we have these twin objectives of peace and denuclearization, both parties have to be mindful, both the US and ROK have to be mindful of that and not undermine each other in our efforts. That's why we have the difficult coordination on sanctions policy, UN sanctions, exemptions to sanctions, humanitarian issues, because we have to coordinate closely. I wanted to just briefly in closing touch on something that Minister Kim said that I thought was very important about a future-looking US-ROK alliance. I strongly endorse that concept. I think the vision of the US-ROK alliance ultimately should be rooted in something other than just deterring aggression from the DPRK. I think our alliance offers something of very special value to the world, and that while it will have to grow and adapt in the event of a peace agreement on the peninsula, I don't think that that would be the last chapter of the US-ROK alliance. I think that the two nations should pledge eternal friendship and cooperation. We've done so much together in the world already, but there's a lot more that we can do. And I think a future-oriented alliance is something that would be a great problem to have, wouldn't it? To discuss the priorities and the task list for the US-ROK alliance after we make peace with the DPRK. I would very much prefer to work on that problem than to work on the challenge of convincing the North to abandon their nuclear weapons and make peace.
Thank you. Probably we're going to have 4 minutes more, so this is going to be last comments. So shall I ask Minister Kiman Cho, do you have any suggestion to Biden administration as a South Korean scholar and former Minister of Unification Minister?
First of all, in the Trump administration, there were deficiencies in its negotiations with North Korea. Of course, there were 3 summits, exchanging of letters, which were helpful in managing the situation. Yet, in the perspective of negotiation itself, there were a couple of shortcomings, and overcoming them would be helpful for the Biden administration as it engages, if it is to engage with negotiation with DPRK. The essence of the negotiation have, I believe, been skewed in some level. The big deal, dividing it as a big deal and small deal, and saying that if there should be a small deal, then a no deal is more preferred, was what broke down Hanoi at the end. But negotiations are neither big nor small. Negotiations can reach the end goal even with small steps, and even with agreements, if that agreement cannot be implemented, it is a failure. And in that sense, it's important for us to understand the essence of negotiation. The second point is that the tool of sanctions, were used too strictly in the Trump administration. Ultimately, sanctions are not the end goal, it's a tool. It is a tool to be used to achieve the end goal of denuclearization. We should be able to flexibly utilize sanctions as a tool to achieve that goal. And I believe this is one of the tasks for the Biden administration. In the denuclearization negotiation, we should not skimp over the tools of sanctions, but in the process, yet there's a necessity to simplify the process of sanctions. Last point I want to make is that Trump administration had a lot of opportunities to build confidence, but did not utilize these opportunities. Building trust with North Korea can come in small areas and even big areas. There are things that we can do during sanctions and things we can do after easing sanctions. So even with multiple opportunities, those opportunities were not fully utilized by the Trump administration, and I believe that is what caused the failure of building trust. So for Biden administration in the early time, I hope the president-elect would focus more on how to build that trust and make preparations in this confidence building process. I believe this could accelerate denuclearization end goal.
Mr. Joel Wit, would you like to have some last comment on the some suggestion to South Korean government? Please.
Can you repeat that, please? I didn't hear what you said.
Okay. I would like ask you some suggestion to South Korean government to deal with North Korean issue in the beginning of the Biden administration.
That's a tough question. I'm not sure what to suggest for the South Korean government, except to encourage the Biden administration to get started as soon as possible.
Okay.
Beyond that, I don't have any suggestions for South Korea. And I agree with what the minister said and what Frank said too about, the role of the alliance in particular. I think the alliance, if we succeed, the alliance will have to change. It doesn't mean it'll go away, but it will definitely have to change. And that's not a bad thing, but I think there'll be a lot of resistance to that in the United States.
Thank you very much for all of you. I really appreciate with your comprehensive discussion and insightful suggestion to both governments in dealing with North Korea. As a scholar, I've learned a lot from this discussion. Actually, this is kind of, we have 1 minute over. So this is the end of the discussion. Thank you very much for all of you. And thank you very much for some people who are watching this discussion. Thank you.
감사합니다. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning and good evening to those of you joining from Washington or the US somewhere. I think we have an audience of some size out there, as this is being live streamed by the Unification Ministry. So welcome to anyone who happens to be watching and joining us. This is a North Korea experts discussion, is how this is billed, and we're starting the second session here today. I'm John Delury. I'm a professor at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies, and I'll be the moderator for the discussion. Our topic for this group, for this panel, is US ROK coordination issues in terms of a peace process for the Korean Peninsula. And we have a great group assembled, bringing together folks from, I guess, from here in Seoul and over there in Washington, D.C. We have, the idea here is to speak a little more informally to one another to get a real discussion going and interaction. So I encourage you to, after we do an initial round of kind of opening, relatively short remarks to get it kicked off, to please feel free to pick up on one another's ideas and to interact and build a conversation. As I understood the prompts, I put them into sort of 4 categories. So maybe for starters, we can think about that. There's questions about, in terms of the US and South Korea working together with the new administration in Washington. There's a set of questions that seem to be about kind of strategy. What is the basic strategy? And to remind ourselves, where does North Korea fit from the perspective of Seoul versus the perspective of Washington? And also looking at it in terms of the strategy for the region. So that would be kind of one category that we could hear your thoughts on. Secondly is getting now more into the North Korea stuff, more policy than strategy. What are the ideas about North Korea policy? Obviously, here the government's been in place for a while and it's more fully developed, whereas in Washington we'll be leaning on you guys over there to give us insights into where the North Korea policy discussion is right now and where you think it's headed. A third topic would be personnel. Again, the people here are known, but of course the favorite parlor game in our circles is who's going to be doing what. And the famous saying, personnel is policy. We're seeing the top level announcements come out. Every couple days, announcements are made. And so insights and thoughts from both sides about who's going to be doing what and kind of the matchups, the teams between the two. And then I suppose the last but very important category is the kind of nuts and bolts of mechanisms, process mechanisms, as well as substantively some issues to get things going. So insofar as the alliance wants to really make some progress on a peace agenda, peace process, whatever you want to call it, how to do that. There are questions about continuing the structures that have been built up over the course of the Trump administration, the working group, for example, as opposed to new mechanisms. And again, which issues, looking toward the imminent future, what are the issues where you all see some low-hanging fruit to get some traction? So that's about as much as I hope to say for the entire duration of this discussion. As moderator, I can just hopefully call on you all. We have a group of 5 panels. We'll be joined hopefully soon by Harry Kazanias, Senior Director of Korean Studies at the National Interest. We have Frank Aum, Senior Expert at USIP, United States Institutes of Peace. Jenny Town, Fellow at the Stimson Center and Deputy Director at 38 North. Kim Sang-gi, Fellow at KINU, Korean Institute of National Unification. And Lee Jong-chol, Professor at Sungsil University. So we have a wonderful group here, a range of expertise and insights. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys now. And I thought I'd maybe just kind of stagger from Washington to Seoul. Frank, maybe you could get us started. Try to at least hit 5 minutes of ideas, but no more than 10 for this first round, and then we'll build from there. So Frank, please.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's good to be talking about these important issues with many of my colleagues in both South Korea and the US. I guarantee you I will not go 5 minutes. I didn't realize we have to prepare remarks. So I did listen in on the previous session with Joel Wit and Frank Januzi and Kiman Cho. And so I guess the one point I would make is as we begin the new administration with President-elect Biden, I think we need to be concerned about narrative and which side is going to seize and control the narrative, right? I think for North Korea, what they don't want is to be stuck in the status quo, right? Because the status quo is not good for them, which is a situation of economic dysfunction, the sanctions continuing to bite, continuing to be ostracized from the international community. And so obviously there's been debate in the United States about whether North Korea will, be conducting a provocative action early on. Actually, I agree with what Joel said that, it's not that clear. There's been instances where they've taken action early in the beginning of the administration of a new president, but oftentimes there's been other factors involved. And certainly in 2021, where, they're still retreating into their shell because of COVID and other domestic issues, they certainly will have to address them and may not be wanting to instigate a situation in the US this early. That being said, like I said, they don't want to be in the status quo where they're in an unenviable situation in terms of their relationship with the international community and their own economic situation. So that's why I think that it's best to not give North Korea the opportunity to seize that narrative, to take an aggressive act that then puts the U.S. on defense, because if they have to respond to a provocative act, they can't be seen as appeasers. And so automatically we begin this cycle, this time-sucking cycle of UN Security Council resolutions, military countermeasures, diplomatic condemnation, and we lose a year, we lose 2 years when we know what that cycle is like. So I think my recommendation is for the United States government to seize the narrative and try to defuse tensions and engage with North Korea as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you, Frank. That was admirably succinct, but you made some really great points. First of all, and I don't know who, I'll try, we'll those of us who listened on the first session, as I did as well, we can interject that because it was a really great discussion. We can build on that. But you introduced a new idea about, or term at least, about narrative, and I think that's one that we definitely want to develop in our discussion. And also also readiness, who's ready for what, I think is one of the really big questions. And so you opened up that discussion. So thank you for getting us started with that. Maybe I'll turn next, Kim Sang-gi, to you, and you can give us your opening thoughts.
Yeah.
As Dr. Frank said, I have a lot of points that I agree with him, actually. With the start of the Biden administration, in the initial stage of that administration, I believe situational management is extremely important. And as you said, there's no need to unnecessarily pressure or instigate North Korea. And on that point, it's because North Korea might react aggressively, and that is a possibility we cannot rule out. And in that case, US-DPRK relations would only worsen, and considerable time will be wasted where the two sides cannot engage in dialogue. So in the initial stage of the Biden administration, situation management is important. And basically, I believe that next year, in early next year, if North Korea conducts its strategic weapons testing, I do not foresee high possibility of North Korea focusing on strategic weapons, because next January, in the 8th Party Congress, North Korea would continue its policy line where it is dormant at this point. I do not foresee North Korea to break away from the current trends and try to intentionally intensify tensions. However, if a situation happens in a case where North Korea is unnecessarily instigated, then we cannot rule out that possibility. An example would be conduct of ROK-US combined exercise. Or another example, something that we hope to not happen, but in the early Biden administration, if a senior official criticizes Kim Jong-un, in that case, North Korea would be aggressive. So on that point, the situation management of US-DPRK and Peninsula is extremely important in the early stage of the Biden administration. And so a cease or delay of the ROK-US combined exercise would be something that the ROK and US would have to talk about in the initial stage. And also, the canceling or delaying of the combined exercise could also give the preventive effects of DPRK's strategic weapons testing and could also contribute in better relations. As we all know, North Korea says that US needs to first withdraw its hostilities for North Korea to engage in negotiation. I believe that principle would be applied to the Biden administration as well. And in that case, a canceling or delaying of the combined exercises could help create the conditions of negotiations for North Korea and a confidence building step. Furthermore, another important point is that the 2018 Singapore joint declaration that happened under Trump administration, whether the US, the Biden administration would endorse this in the early stage. If this happens, then if that endorsement happens, then I believe the situation management could effectively be managed and could open up the pathway for better conditions for future negotiations and confidence building step. I will conclude my remarks with this.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Built really nicely on Frank's points. I'm trying to keep a list here of recommendations that the group comes up with. And so in addition, I think you added a bit to Frank's idea of seize the narrative by suggesting an early endorsement of the Singapore statement. That was something that came out in the first session as well. So we can continue to discuss that. But of course, I encourage dissenting views, particularly as an academic. We find it much more interesting when people disagree. So by no means feel obliged that we all think alike. And then I think a second kind of set of recommendations, you analyzed the risks of avoiding that cycle of provocation that Frank talked about. But interestingly, you kind of turned it on the in terms of advice to Washington of what not to do to avoid its set of provocations, on your assumption that you think actually the North Koreans are not heading toward to doing one of their own, and made a specific recommendation to suspend or delay the springtime exercises. I think that's definitely something. Turn to you next, Jenny. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that and in general, and come back to others. And of course, that would have to happen almost now, if not on day one, because there's a planning cycle. So we can maybe think about the nitty-gritty of how to actually do that, and whether there's political space to do that. That's going to look weak in an American context, and so we can get insight from the folks in Washington. But Jenny, there's already some stuff on the table. Feel free to ignore that and introduce your own ideas or respond as you so desire. So please, Jenny.
Great, thanks, John, and thank you to the Ministry of Unification for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to see everyone. I saw Kim Sung-gi just a day or two ago, and so it's unfortunate we can't do this in Seoul live. I haven't been back to Korea since January, and I really miss it. So hopefully early in the next year, we'll be able to resume face-to-face contact. I think it was great that Frank started out with seizing the narrative and controlling the narrative, because I think that's really important right now. We're at a really kind of critical juncture, with this political transition, with the stalling, in US-DPRK relations since the Hanoi summit, and especially since the working level meeting in October. There hasn't been much movement. There hasn't been much communication. But that means there also hasn't been negative movement and negative communication from the North Koreans as well. And so that's one thing we've seen from Kim Jong-un is when Biden, for instance, first announced he was running, the North Koreans had a very vocal response and a very negative response to him. But we haven't seen that this year. We haven't seen overly profuse praise of Trump either. So I think it's clear that the North Koreans have been watching, have been trying to keep their options open, have been trying to calibrate and trying to figure out what this political transition is going to mean and what the Biden administration might come out with. I think it's important that the Biden administration staffs up early to show that it is serious about takes this issue seriously. And I think it's important that they message to the North Koreans early that they're not going to, and hopefully that they're not just throwing away everything Trump did. And so, as Kim Sung-gi had mentioned, reiterating, reaffirming the Singapore joint statement as a beginning agenda, utilizing some of the tools of communication that Trump opened up, such as the letters going back and forth, sending letters about what opportunities exist, in order to, show that one, you're not throwing away, the Biden administration won't just throw away everything Trump did, but also that the Biden administration is not the Obama administration. So the North Koreans have a very kind of negative memory of strategic patience. And the problem is if you leave the North Koreans to guess what a Biden administration is likely to do, that lingering thought of strategic patience is still going to be there. So I think it's really important to get that point across, that this is a new administration, that there is a new opportunity. It won't look the same as either of those before, and to give us a chance to get that started. I would add one note to that, though, is a comment that comes up a lot and a suggestion that comes up a lot as sort of a first foray into trying to resume talks is, instead of talking about the relationship and the nuclear issues, is to start with COVID-19. And I actually think this is a mistake. And for a lot of the reasons that, Kim Sung-gi just mentioned as well, about controlling the narrative and about the optics of the situation. By starting with COVID-19, it naturally puts North Korea in a position of weakness. It's showing their weakness. They need help. We're offering them help, even if it's posed as like, the global community is trying to tackle this together. In a bilateral context, that's not going to come across as a global effort. It's going to come across as a power and a weak effort. And so I think, there's other ways to address COVID-19, and, North Korea has been working with other international organizations. And if we're really serious about trying to pull them into those conversations, to do that in a multilateral format rather than bilateral format, but to keep the discussion on a bilateral level about the relationship, about the things, about the substantive matters of what we need to deal with. Again, reaffirming the Singapore joint statement and showing that there is a path forward and that there is a chance to have a different relationship. So I think with that, dealing with the exercises will be an early challenge. And I think a lot of how we respond to that will certainly be predicated by whether or not North Korea does something to force our hand. But I think the other thing that we really need to think about, since this forum is really about cooperation, US-ROK cooperation, is also being ready for anything and having those discussions and consultations now about what happens if North Korea does do these things. Because the last thing we want is in a new administration to have sort of everyone flailing in the wind, trying to figure out how we're going to respond, how South Korea would likely respond, how Japan might likely respond to anything that's predictable actions coming down the pike. So I think, those discussions also should start now, so that, we really do restore the strategic relationship that the U.S.-South Korea alliance is supposed to have, and that we really get on the same page early and be able to coordinate, so we're not stepping over each other and not guessing what each other are going to do in the future.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. A lot of great points there. Again, kind of filling out recommendation number one, seize the narrative. You add the point about these concerns, I think both in Seoul and in Pyongyang, that Biden is going to be Obama 2.0 and strategic patience. And so how to really, I think we're kind of, at least you never know what's your echo chamber. I'm hearing more and more of like, no, that won't be it. But, it's got to be more than in these expert dialogues that people say they don't think that's what's going to happen, right? And so, so how to make that signal One point that came out, I'd bring in here from the first session, I think it was maybe Frank Januzi or Joel, I forget, someone who remembers can tell me, I think it was Joel now actually, Wit, who made the point about Blinken's confirmation hearings, you know, in whatever the 2 sentences on North Korea, to think very carefully about who really cares about those sentences. It's probably Seoul and Pyongyang. I mean, who's paying attention to North Korea and the United States right now? And so to really be deliberate about that and how to use that, Joel made a good point. And then also I want to come back and I'll probably ask all of you, but Jenny raised the issue of staffing. Again, you're going to have to name names. All she said was do it early, but hear more about the issue and kind of related. Again, our 4th category, the nuts and bolts, she stressed the importance of the mechanism for this coordination for Seoul and Washington, for the new administration to be talking immediately. How do you guys conceive of that happening? And is the current setup sufficient, or does it need to be adjusted? Do there need to be new mechanisms? And then last one, we need to get back to COVID. That's a really interesting point Jenny makes, that it could backfire. And I've heard kind of both sides of that. Hopefully we have different views in here. But that's an excellent point about reading North Korea and being careful about how to approach COVID. So, okay. Well, maybe, I don't know if I haven't got an update if Harry's going to join us or not. At any point, he's welcome to join. If you're listening to us, Harry, on YouTube. But otherwise, let's now go to Professor Lee Jung-chol from Sungsil. Please share your ideas with us.
Yes, Professor Lee Jung-chol from Sungsil University. I want to start the discussion starting from the 8th Party Congress that's planned in North Korea. In the end of January, North Korea announced that it will hold this session. Considering the dates of this, I believe that the Party Congress would start immediately before the Supreme Session. That means that the Party Congress would happen sometime after January 20, and followed on by the Supreme Council meeting. And the reason why I talk about this timeline is because the Party Congress and its Supreme People's Meeting would happen after the inauguration. Highly likely that it'll happen after the inauguration of the Biden administration. What this means is that Kim Jong-un would first listen to the inauguration address, then probably set its foreign affairs policy line. Looking at this then timeline, narrative is something that's very important. And as all the speakers said, whether Singapore Declaration will be endorsed is something to be discussed. I believe it's a good idea for it to be discussed, but I believe there are 2 messages through this endorsement which the US must keep. I believe that I am concerned whether Biden administration will be able to easily implement these. I think the endorsement of the Singapore Declaration sends 2 messages to North Korea. The first message is the message of conducting bilateral summits. The second is that it'll conduct top-down summits. The endorsement of Singapore Declaration has an important rhetoric, but whether Biden would, without Biden administration's decision that there will be bilateral meetings or summits, it will be difficult for Biden to easily endorse the Singapore Declaration. So this is something that we should closely monitor. The second point I want to make is that our perspective on the 8th Party Congress would be important. In this Party Congress, I will watch out for whether North Korea would pursue dependency on China for its development policy or its self-reliance as its development policy. I think this is something that we should look out for in the Party Congress. There is a possibility that North Korea might rely on China, and should North Korea choose this line, then the Korean government would have a lot of difficulties in pursuing inter-Korean policies, inter-Korean relations. And on this point, I believe Korea and the US should assess how they should talk about how they should assess North Korea's dependency on China should this happen in the Party Congress. So on this point, I believe that the ROK and US should be able to separate the Indo-Pacific strategy and its North Korean policy. North Korean policy should not be positioned under the umbrella of the Indo-Pacific policy, because this would open up a lot of difficulties in the Asia policy and Peninsula policy. So, on this sense, we should carefully analyze the Eighth Party Congress. Thank you.
Very interesting. We're lucky to have one of the best North Korea watchers in town with us. And if I can ask one quick follow-up, just a kind of empirical one, Professor Lee, on the timing of the Congress, because I think maybe it was all prior to the announcement that the Supreme People's Assembly would come late in January, but the analysis I had seen based on, I guess, the 80-day battle was that the Party Congress will come at the beginning of January, that is to say, before the inauguration. You're expecting it to come maybe right after the inauguration. Is that based on the previous patterns, or do you think it's still possible it could come earlier in January? Just like to hear a little bit more in the weeds on that.
Well, in North Korea, for North Korea to conduct its Party Congress, it should first mobilize the representatives of the provincial areas, and that happens around 20 days before the Party Congress. That's when the public announcement is made. But there has not been any public announcement yet that it will select the representatives from the provincial areas. What that means is, even if it happens right away, it will happen after January 20. And so I do not think that there's a possibility that the Party Congress would happen early January. And right after its Party Congress, it assembles the Supreme People's Meeting. And then that would mean, and North Korea announced that it would conduct that Supreme Meeting end of January. And since North Korea conducts Party Congress immediately before the Supreme People's Meeting, and the results of the Party Congress to be legalized in the Supreme People's Meeting, considering that timeline, I think that it'll happen after the inauguration. And since the inauguration happens on January 20, ultimately this means that North Korea would listen to the inauguration first, then decide, and then announce its decisions in the Party Congress and the Supreme People's Meetings.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So often you get North Korea experts saying, "Oh, you can't predict anything." I love to have a very concrete, empirically backed reasoning, and that timing is, critically important. So thank you for that. I mean, I suppose take it back. I was just going to say, sort of to Jenny and Frank. I mean, when we talk about the narrative and signals, I mean, I'm not expecting North Korea to come up in the inaugural. We have to be kind of real. We're all focused on North Korea, but I constantly feel the need to reality check ourselves by what matters right now for the Biden-Harris administration. You guys know better because you're over there. But anyway, that's an important piece about the timing and the signaling and this delicate transition. And also, I'd like to explore more about the China factor. Professor Lee makes, maybe I'll throw this first at you, Jenny and Frank. I would say a somewhat radical suggestion of separating the Indo-Pacific and sort of broader China strategy that we can anticipate coming in the Biden era. Was probably a lot of continuity from the Trump era. Separate that from North Korea. Is that realistic? How do you guys see the strategic relationship between what the United States wants to do in the region, working with allies and partners, focus, because China is a priority, and how does that relate back to this whole discussion about US ROK cooperation on North Korea? I'd be very curious to hear more of your thoughts. So kind of at the broad strategic level, and of course you as well, Kim Sang-gi. So should we just kind of go back in order? Frank, do you want to start? And Jenny, and then over to Sang-gi. Frank?
Sure. So I want to be cautious and wait to see what type of policy the Biden administration implements first when it comes to the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region. I think, if you're talking about a broader policy that recognizes the value of the Asia-Pacific and our presence there, then I think naturally there's going to be sort of an overlap with our North Korea policy, especially when we think about particularly the Korean Peninsula and some of the strategies we saw in the Obama administration, which was that we want to put pressure on China to put pressure on North Korea. And if North Korea continues to take negative actions, then the US will continue to do things that are adverse to China, things like the THAAD deployment, right? So in that sense, I feel like there's already a natural overlap there. But then again, like I said before, I want to be cautious because we don't know exactly how the Biden administration will move forward on this.
Okay, Jenny, you have thoughts on this one? And if I can complicate it a little bit more, while we're talking at this kind of bigger strategic and regional level, no one's mentioned Japan. But, again, when I zoom out, I assume Biden people are going to come to South Korea and say, okay, before we get to North Korea, here's what we want to do on China, and here's where we'd like you to be more with us. Here's what we'd like to do with Japan and trilateral, and we'd like you to be more with us. Okay, now let's get to North Korea. Do you think are those linkages not being made in the discussions you're hearing and having? Is it possible, again, to try, I think as Professor Lee is suggesting, he can comment again, to just kind of separate these things? What's your view?
I would agree with Frank. First, we can't assume what Biden's policy on Indo-Pacific is going to be, if they're going to kind of take it in the same direction that the Trump administration was trying to take it. But these issues are obviously linked, right? You can't have, like, part of the Indo-Pacific strategy deals with US ROK relations, deals with US-Japan relations, deals with regional security relations, and all of these will have overlapping consequences and triggers with North Korea policy. As Frank was talking about, if North Korea is overly aggressive and provocative, it is going to trigger other things like THAAD deployments and I'm sure with Japan, further deployments of missile defenses as well, which are going to upset the balance in terms of regional security from the Chinese perspective as well. So, it's sort of like, it would be ideal to be able to decouple the Korea peace agenda and the nuclear agenda, but they're inextricably linked, where as soon as you start to talk about one, you start to pull the other one back in as well. I think the same is true for North Korea policy and Indo-Pacific strategy, is that there are linkages there that are undeniable and that will sort of play off of each other throughout that policy. So, nothing happens in a vacuum. The big question is going to be whether the Biden administration is going to have the capacity to multitask. In the Trump administration, that was a little bit harder. They were understaffed. Hopefully, part of the Biden strategy is to get staffed, and in terms of going back to the signaling isn't just messages and isn't just the public messages, but there's a lot of signaling that can happen with the actions as well. So if Biden, for instance, names a special representative or a special envoy on North Korea policy right away, that is a big signal to the North Koreans that he's taking this seriously, that this is an issue of importance to him. If he doesn't, that's also going to be a signal that the North Koreans will interpret as probably taking it less seriously as well. So there's all of these things are interconnected, and there's still a lot of questions about what Biden will do and what the Biden administration will come up with.
Okay, great. So both Frank and Jenny, if I'm hearing right, are cautioning against any assumptions that we know what they're going to do on the region and the China piece and Indo-Pacific. With that caution, they're also kind of saying it's going to be hard to separate these things. Kim Sang-gi, any thoughts? I mean, for example, you recommended in the first round suspension or delay something of the joint military exercises. I can see at least some voices in the new administration saying, well, okay, that might make sense vis-a-vis North Korea. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But it's not good for showing the alliances are back, because it's also about China. It's also about some kind of bigger picture than the Korean Peninsula. Are you concerned about that? Do you think there's a response to that would still justify your recommendation?
On that point, this is something that the Biden administration and our administration should closely coordinate. In Biden administration, as a regional strategy, I believe that Biden administration would acknowledge the value of the ROK-US combined exercises, but we should also think about its negative implications on the peace of the Korean Peninsula. And on that point, seizing the combined exercise is something that the ROK-US government should closely discuss. And if the combined exercises happen and North Korea aggressively responds to these exercises, there will be various aftermath, which to some are predictable. And those predictable situations look very grim. And for us to prevent that grim situation, I feel like the ROK and US should closely work to coordinate on this combined exercises. And regarding Indo-Pacific strategy, the separation of Indo-Pacific strategy and the North Korean policy, I want to add on to say that this is an important point. In my perspective, is that the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and North Korea policy should be separated. I agree with Dr. Lee. And recently, I feel like there are those who argue in Washington that North Korea's denuclearization in short term is not realistic. In other words, denuclearization is not an easy task. And so shutting down or so containing and deterring North Korea should happen first. I think that there are those who argue this line. However, to those people who argue this, I'd say that that method just leads to the Biden administration's North Korea policy to fall under the Indo-Pacific strategy. In the case that Biden administration links the two, then it's likely for the North Korean policy to just to become the slave of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Looking back to Obama's administration, the Obama administration did not really proactively work on engaging North Korea, but chose to pressure North Korea and impose sanctions and focus more on China's containment. This was the crux of the rebalancing strategy, I believe. In other words, during Obama administration, the rebalancing strategy had North Korea's nuclear as a pretense to strengthen the ROK-US alliance and use that against China. And so that led to North Korea's nuclear issue being disregarded. And in that case, and during that time, North Korea significantly sophisticated its capabilities. So this, I believe, is what happened during the Obama administration. I believe that this should not be repeated in the Biden administration. And for that to happen, and for that to be prevented, I believe that Indo-Pacific strategy and North Korean policy should be separated.
Okay, thank you for that. And if there's any Yonhap headline writers out there watching, at least in the English translation, Dr. Kim, your line not to make, I can just read it now. North Korea expert says, don't make North Korea policy slave of Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a great line. And I think we have identified a tension point, you know, at the very basic level of strategy, but some good ideas about how to try to kind of nuance through it. So I wanted to come back to you, Professor Lee, and actually sort of ask you a question that Jenny posed in her initial point. Given your reading of North Korean statements of behavior this year, so much of which, of course, has been about COVID, what do you think of the idea of some sort of COVID diplomacy, public health diplomacy? There's a lot of discussion about that. Obviously here, President Moon Jae-in has brought it up a number of times. And then after asking you, maybe this can be around for others who have thoughts, I would kind of pair in terms of, again, how to get some traction. In the discussion I'm hearing here, one is COVID public health diplomacy, especially around a vaccine, as that comes online. A second is the Tokyo Olympics, whether they indeed happen, but there's a lot of discussion around that to kind of try and hitch on to that. And so your thoughts on whether that is viable. And well, that's probably enough. Maybe we start with those two, or if you have other ideas about ways to kind of get things moving, apart from the core negotiation, and maybe in the following round, we can get into that. Where does the negotiation go? So Professor Lee, thoughts on COVID or other ways to engage early on, whether North Koreans are ready for it or not?
First of all, regarding COVID, as Minister Kang from MOFA and Kim Yo-jong, there has been a severe debate regarding this, saying that there is a COVID issue, and responding that to saying that it is an affront to the NK regime. I believe that such dispute is unnecessary. North Korea has a China-style disease prevention and control model. If we acknowledge that North Korea has the capabilities of a nation, then as China did through its shutting down of borders, it is responding to COVID, and there's a need for us to respect this prevention measure. Instead of saying that thinking that North Korea is lying, but to acknowledge that North Korea is working for disease prevention using a China model, I do not foresee North Korea to strongly respond to Korea's accusations. And regarding Tokyo Olympic, Japan has a lot of Japan is strongly pursuing this, and North Korea is also, I believe, has the intention to participate in the Tokyo Olympic. And as you know, the 2018 the Peninsula peace happened with the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And looking back at that experience through Tokyo Olympic, I believe that another peace initiative can be made in East Asia. And so for surrounding countries to give the conditions for North Korea to participate in the Tokyo Olympics could help build the peace initiative. And with that goal, I believe the surrounding nations should work together to achieve that. And even if Tokyo Olympic does not happen, we have upcoming Beijing Olympic into 2022. And in this Olympic, considering North Korea and China's relations, DPRK would actively participate in the China Olympics. And so, at least if the peace event cannot happen in the Tokyo Olympic, at least we can foresee that to happen in the Beijing Olympic. And so, having this in mind, keeping this in mind, I believe that the Pyeongchang Peace Initiative could shift to Tokyo or Beijing Olympic. And I believe that the Korean government has such firm will, and this should be coordinated closely with the US to shape favorable policy environments for it to work to open up the pathway to build peace on East Asia.
Okay, so yeah, Jenny, please jump in.
I just wanted to respond to that. In my discussions with Japanese government officials, for instance, part of the reason why the Pyeongchang Olympics was the Peace Olympics was the South Korean government invested a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and really went out of their way to bring the North Koreans in. The Japanese have no desire to do that. So, even for North Korea's participation in the Tokyo Olympics, the decision lies with the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, not with the Japanese government are not going to go out of their way for the North Koreans the way that the South Koreans did. And so I think, we have to be, realistic about what opportunities are there. And so the same thing with Kim Yo-jong's statement about Foreign Minister Kang's description of the North Koreans and their COVID situation, where again, as much as North Korea needs assistance, all countries are struggling with COVID right now. It makes sense to have global health outreach on this issue because it is a global health issue. As we've said before, North Korea, when they're dealing with the US and they're dealing with South Korea, are looking to build leverage to look strong. And COVID cooperation is not that area of strength. And so, what they've been doing in the meantime, what we saw, for instance, in the October 10th parade, a whole new look to their military, new weapon systems, new ICBM, new SLBM. These are the kinds of issues that they direct to the US, to the adversaries, US, South Korea, Japan. So, starting with COVID-19, while it might sound good, the optics don't work. And I think we see that with Kim Yo-jong's statement to Foreign Minister Kang as well, is that they interpret this as us showing their weakness. And it's not the right note to start a new administration trying to make inroads and build a relationship with the North Koreans.
If I can
Hey,
just
Frank, yeah, please.
Yeah, I want to agree with two of Jenny's statements. One, again, is I'm not optimistic about the Tokyo Olympics being the right forum for sort of reinvigorating engagement with North Korea. It's easy to just say, oh, well, it worked in Pyeongchang, now it's going to work in Tokyo. It's just an entirely different situation. Like Jenny said, that South Korea was more invested and would provide a much more welcoming environment. It's not the case under the Suga administration. And also just the dynamics are different with COVID still lingering. So that's point one. I would say, if anything, Beijing probably provides a more suitable backdrop to North Korea participating. And we're not talking about just a sports delegation. It's the higher level political, the Kim Yo-jong, the Kim Nam-nam that came with the delegation, right? That allowed the political process to move forward. And then on COVID, I agree that Jenny made a great point about being sensitive to North Korea's psyche, right? They have pride, and they don't want to be perceived as just receiving all this assistance from the United States or other countries. Again, I think what would make sense in terms of kickstart or jumpstarting engagement is to look exactly at what North Korea has been saying about things like the security assurances. So nuclear security, nuclear and strategic asset deployments to the Korean Peninsula, the exercises. These sorts of things, I think, would be more things that would catch North Korea's ear and would make them feel like they're actually entering into something that an engagement process that they've been looking for, things like sanctions relief and not humanitarian assistance.
So let me just ask one more to Frank and Jenny while we have them in full reality check pessimism mode, as our good Beltway representatives are supposed to do, and then turn back to Dr. Kim and Professor Lee. So a third one that comes up, COVID, the Olympics. Third one, and of course President Moon has made big push at this numerous times, is the end of war declaration. That's been around for a while. I mean, if you were here, there was some hope that President Moon was going to go to Singapore and actually do the declaration as a spoken declaration back then. So it's been around for a long time. You guys are very familiar with it, of course. But what is your assessment of that? Are you sort of equally pessimistic that that's not, in terms of a US ROK coordination piece, that's not a good piece in the next 6 months or so? Or what's your assessment, Jenny and Frank? Jenny?
제가 말씀 먼저 드리겠습니다.
If I could start with that comment. To just segue back to the Olympics and then talk about the end of war declaration. As you said, I believe there's more possibility for a peace event to happen more in Beijing than in Tokyo. But in terms of Korea's government's perspective, if it's better for the Korean government for the peace event to happen in Tokyo for Korea-US and Korea-Japan relations. And so for Korean government hopes Suga, Prime Minister Suga, to be more proactive in North Korean policies. And if Japan cannot solve this issue, then that event would then lead on to Beijing Olympics. North Korea would wish to have that event in Beijing. Korea would want it in Tokyo, would persuade Japan and North Korea for that peace event to happen in Tokyo. But ultimately, it depends on the Japanese government. And secondly, regarding end of war declaration. The endorsement of Singapore declaration, as Jenny also said, and regarding this endorsement, I said that there are two messages that are sent. The first is a bilateral top-down meeting. The second The first is the top-down summit. The second is the bilateral meeting. Going back, if U.S. makes that endorsement of Singapore, then that means that US and DPRK would consider end of war declaration as the starting line, as it was the most important piece of the Singapore Declaration. And so if Biden administration endorses Singapore Declaration, then end of war declaration would definitely be an important agenda as we move forward. And for Korean governments, the end of war declaration will be a summary, it will be a closure of the North Korean policy, which I guess initiated from the Trump administration, would be a stepping stone as we move, for us to move forward for peace. And so my perspective is that end of war declaration is extremely important.
Okay, yeah, Jenny and Dr. Kim, I want to bring you back in whenever. It's been a while to hear from you, your thoughts on this. But Jenny first, maybe a two-finger.
Yeah, I would question the perception that reaffirming the Singapore Declaration means that we're reaffirming top-down diplomacy and reaffirming summits. I don't think that's how the US looks at that. What the US looks at in the Singapore Declaration and Singapore Joint Statement is that it's an agenda. Here are the 4 areas of the agenda, 3 kind of substantive pillars, and then 1 action area on the POW MIA remains. But working on the working towards a different relationship, working towards I'm blanking now. Working towards peace regime, yeah. So so I wouldn't go so far as to say that if we reaffirm it, that means we're going to have summits. That's not necessarily the case, and that's not necessarily what the US would mean if they did reaffirm it. They're reaffirming that agenda, and they're reaffirming that those are the goals that we're working towards together, that the Trump administration set forth with the North Koreans. That said, I think the end of war declaration is still an interesting piece at play. I think the bigger question is going to be whether movement can happen on the peace agenda separate from an actual nuclear agreement. Because I think that could actually spark some greater movement on the nuclear agenda, right? So, this is something that was rumored that President Trump had actually promised to Kim Jong-un during the Singapore summit, verbally, unofficially. That has been a point of contention throughout the process because the North Koreans keep expecting it and don't necessarily want to keep negotiating for it because they believe that it's something that's owed to them. So I think there is an opportunity for the Biden administration if they want to, if there is one gesture that they can do sort of unilaterally outside of getting an actual nuclear agreement up front, is really to start that process. An end of war declaration doesn't cost the US much politically. South Korea wants it, North Korea wants it. The US technically has already said we're willing to give it. And I think this is an area where the US hopefully can show some flexibility and agility in trying to move that agenda forward.
Frank, two-finger, and then we'll go to you, Dr.
Yeah, it's still not clear to me that people in the United States understand the difference between an end of war declaration and, say, a peace treaty, right? I think there's a lot of confusion when it first came up in 2018. And it was helpful that Moon Jung-in wrote an article in The Atlantic and had to do sort of like this education campaign. And then there was, some reports about the State Department and the Pentagon having discussions about what this would mean. But I think, there's the risk of this lack of clarity. What we saw back in, the mid 2000s when Roh Moo-hyun was trying to push an end of war declaration on President Bush, and there was some confusion about what it meant, and led to an awkward exchange at the APEC meeting. I think that might happen again because I'm not sure that the Biden administration is really keyed in on what an end of war declaration means, all the implications. So I think there's going to be more of an education campaign that's required by the Moon administration if that is something that they really want to press the Biden administration to do.
Have to get Professor Moon back out there again. Dr. Kim, so we've got the COVID piece of this. We've got the Olympics, and really interesting point about Tokyo or Beijing and strategic implications in a way, if the pessimistic assessments are right. And then we've got the end of war declaration. Thoughts on any of those three, or all of them?
Right, then, first of all, about the Tokyo Olympics, I would like to briefly touch upon that and then move on to the end of war declaration. Now then, first about the Tokyo Olympics. Now, let's say for Japan's motivation to turn this into Peace Olympics, I do believe that they would have some motivation, because if there's tension on the Korean Peninsula, let's say if North Korea were to have the firing of the ICBM, let's say if they keep firing this to the East Sea, then will there be guarantee of a peaceful hosting of the Olympics? So Japan would probably be aware of this. So then, that said, then, for Japan as well, they would also hope that the situation on the Korean Peninsula would become more peaceful, and that they might also decide to do something about it, and especially for the 2021, so the 2021, so the first half. And I understand that Tokyo Olympics is slated for the end of July, so then in the first half of 2021, I believe that Japan would become more aware of that situation and perhaps would be more interested in keeping the situation here more stable. But of course, I do realize that COVID-19 can be a variable in terms of how Tokyo Olympics would be held. So of course, COVID will be a big factor. So yes, I do believe that that would also, it could potentially change things. And then now moving on to the end of war declaration, as Professor Lee touched upon this as well. Yes, I believe that the end of war declaration would be highly meaningful. And particularly because now for North Korea, they hope that the US hostile policies would go away for them to resume negotiations. So what this means is that for North Korea, they are hoping for more future-oriented North Korea policy to come from the US. So that is their aspiration at this point. In other words, to build trust, or at least to lay the environment to build trust between the two states. So I would say that that is the kind of action that North Korea is waiting for. So it is in that context that the end of war declaration could be highly important, meaning that it could lay the ground for building trust between the two states. And if it were to happen, then, as I have mentioned earlier, so for example, the combined training, so with the suspension of that, and then following that, if there is the end of war declaration, then the North Korean nuclear negotiation taking place again, I believe that the likelihood of that happening will be much, much heightened. So let me reiterate. So as the entry point to the denuclearization negotiation, the end of war declaration could be highly meaningful. Now, but then at this point, what I would like to say as a point of caution is that now for the end of war declaration, yes, Frank actually mentioned something very important. So yes, in session 1, they didn't really differentiate between the peace treaty or the end of war declaration, or in terms of the legal, let's say the legal meaning of the end of war declaration. So it appears as if they give some legal meaning to this as well. Of course, depending on how the end of war declaration is actually undertaken, it could be political, it could also be legal. But what I mean by the end of war declaration at this point is more of a political statement. So assuming that, assuming that the end of war declaration is going to be a political statement, then now once we have this end of war declaration, then what we have to be cautious about is that we should not let this be a one-off thing. So we should not let this be a one-off event with nothing to follow up, and just going back to hostile rhetoric between the US or North Korea, or repetition of the same old actions. Then the end of war declaration would be rendered meaningless. So yes, on one hand, I do believe that the end of war declaration is meaningful and important, but what we have to be cautious about is that we should not let this become a one-off event. And then one more thing that I would like to mention is what I had mentioned earlier, that the end of war declaration can serve as the entry to reopening the negotiation for North Korean nuclear program. And one way of making sure that this is not a one-off event is to ensure that the end of war declaration can lead to peace treaty. So yes, end of war declaration, and then of course peace treaty. We also need to have negotiations. So if the end of war declaration were to lead to peace treaty, then I believe that this would be instrumental in building up a peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So end of war declaration could be a very important trigger for that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. So in our remaining time, one second, Jenny, I just want to set this up and then you'll have plenty of time because we're heading toward the close and I want to try and get in two rounds here. One issue we're dancing around now, but the core issue, isn't it, is really how does the peace agenda and process relate to the denuclearization question? Jenny, you broached that and you've expanded on that, Dr. Kim. So I think we need a round of kind of relative, if you can distill your thoughts in terms of where are we? I mean, everyone's talked about Singapore, no one's mentioned Hanoi, but that's where the process broke off. But then of course, maybe we can start with you, Professor Lee, because the North Koreans immediately said, okay, that's it. That's the best deal you're going to get. That deal's off the table. And they've reiterated that numerous times. Whereas when I hear the American conversation, when it gets to Hanoi at all, it says, oh, okay, should we do that or not? Do we care about Yongbyon? Whereas the North Korean position is, you can forget about that. We don't even want sanctions lifted. Now, of course, you can say, oh, that's just what they say. That's not what they mean. But I think we need, I'd like to hear at least a lightning round of thoughts about where the substance of the denuclearization negotiations go and how do the US and South Korea need to try and coordinate their positions on that. With the cautionary to my friends here in South Korea that this is a structure of these conversations about, and I'm guilty here as a moderator, you talk about peace and you put the denuclearization on the caboose. But of course, I think Jenny and Frank can remind us in the United States, that's what people care about, and you got to get movement on that piece, or who's interested on the denuclearization side, or who's interested in peace declarations and let alone peace treaties and the whole rest of it. So a round of thoughts on this one, maybe start with you, Professor Lee.
네.
To Professor Delury, I want to talk about two things. In the first session, Mr. Wit said that arms control and denuclearization talks should happen simultaneously. The issue of denuclearization and arms control are sometimes seen as two sides, as two conflicting sides, but I believe that Mr. Witt phrased it very well, saying that the two should work on simultaneously. What this means is that denuclearization should not be lost. The meaning of denuclearization should not be lost as we continue arms control discussions. End of war declaration and the peace treaty, and also the missile test regarding Tokyo Olympic, and all these threat factors should be placed on the table. All options should be on the table. And bargaining negotiation is the start of an arms control discussion. And in that sense, the end of war declaration and the peace treaty and ICBM and all these should simultaneously placed on the table for us to discuss the time and methods. This is what Joel Wit said in the first session regarding arms control and denuclearization. And I believe that is the essence of working them simultaneously. And I believe, also agree that this is an important point. Another point I want to raise is that North Korea puts a lot of emphasis on symbol and meaning. And so going back to Singapore Declaration or endorsing Singapore Declaration, the meaning and symbol of that endorsement and acknowledgement should be fully understood. Just saying that, oh, we're going to endorse Singapore Declaration, but this is only a start of a negotiation is not fulfilling the expectation of North Korea then. And so I want us to all think about the meaning that embedded in the expression of endorsing or going back to the Singapore summit. And so on that sense, I feel like it'll be difficult for the Biden administration to easily make that statement of going back to the Singapore Declaration or endorsing it. Because having the Singapore Declaration as a starting point is something that should be persuaded by the Korean government for close coordination as the two countries pursue North Korean policy. And so I agree with Jenny, but at the same time, we should also understand North Korea's attitude of how North Korea would perceive the symbol and meaning of the Singapore Declaration.
Great, thank you. Frank, you've done a lot of work on roadmaps. You have that great grit piece. Where are we on the roadmap, and what's next, and how to relate the peace agenda with the denuclearization side?
Yeah, so I mean, you raised Hanoi. I think if you give credence to John Bolton's book, then I think some important takeaways are, one, that President Trump offered sanctions, partial sanctions relief, and Kim Jong-un rejected that. And also, I think it's also telling that President Trump was very eager to get out of there. He wasn't persistent in the negotiations. I mean, it was practically a one-day negotiation. He could have spent more time, but he wanted to be the first one to basically reject the other person before he was rejected himself, right? So I think North Korea's position of wanting the sanctions relief from all the major sanctions starting in 2016, that's a non-starter. That's not going to happen. So North Korea has to be more flexible on that side. And the US has to be a little bit more forthcoming on stuff that they're willing to offer North Korea. The costs have increased for North Korea. And so I think if the US wants to get North Korea's attention, it needs to proactively throw out things like, again, for example, a moratorium on strategic and nuclear asset deployments to the Korean Peninsula, partial sanctions relief. These are things that North Korea already considers should be a part of the corresponding measures for something like Jong-un. In terms of a roadmap, like, I'm not so keen, like, we've been talking about this for 30 years. It's not really the idea of, coming up with, taking such a long time with a policy review to come up with another roadmap. I think we kind of know where we need to go. It's the problem is not ideas. The problem is the political will to move boldly on some of these issues.
Jenny?
Yeah, I agree with Frank, and especially because these are going to be politically unpalatable in DC right now. So there's already talk about, like, if Biden does early measures on North Korea, gets early gains on North Korea, will the Republicans come in and say, oh, he took the deal that not even Trump would take, right? So there's always going to be that criticism, no matter what happens, that you either did too little or too much. And the only way that you get over that is you start gaining traction and start getting small wins along the way. I think that there's I lost my train of thought. But on the end of war declaration, for instance, there has always been this sort of debate about timing and sequencing. Can you have peace without denuclearization? Can you have denuclearization without peace? And I think that the US and North Korean approaches have always been opposed is this, where peace has to, the North Koreans were the peace and trust has to come first to get to the end of the road of denuclearization, whereas the US has always been denuclearization has to come first in order for us to build trust. I think we are starting to find some common ground there. And I think the South Korean urgency of this is part of that process of if South Korea is ready to do it and pushing forward, it keeps pressure on the US to keep North Korea as a higher priority in general, because this is a hard issue. And when it comes to like Indo-Pacific or North Korea policy or China strategy, there are things that the US government understands better than others, and there are things that are easier than others. And there are things that get easier wins and earlier wins than others. And North Korea is always at the bottom end of all of that, right? It's difficult, it's time consuming, it's a lot of effort, and you may or may not get anything out of it. And so a lot of times when it's difficult, that's when attention is diverted to other things. But of course, like on the end of war declaration, this is something that could be useful, right? If we could decouple it from an actual nuclear agreement and move forward with it as sort of a unilateral gesture, making good on some of the previous administration's commitments, and trying to bring the North Koreans back into that space. But part of this will also depend on what North Korea does. Because obviously, if North Korea decides to do something provocative early in a Biden administration, those kinds of actions can't be taken, right? Like there's just no way that they can have, that the administration can have the credibility. Sorry, there's a helicopter going by.
It's like a war zone over there.
It's DC.
We worry about you guys.
So yeah, so that's also going to be a big factor in all of this, where there's always, I feel like there's always these moments where the US may start to be willing to do something, and then North Korea shoots themselves in the foot by doing something that they think will increase their leverage, or something that they're doing for domestic political purposes that just gets misinterpreted by the international community. So this is it's still a two-way street. There's still a lot of room for a lot of different things, but all the actors have to play their parts.
Okay, so I don't know, the minders haven't told me exactly how long we have. I guess we'll go till they shut us down. At maximum, we have 10 minutes left. And so this can be a kind of final round. So thoughts on the substance, but also, ideas. This would be your last chance to throw your pass downfield in terms of at the level of mechanisms of U.S. ROK cooperation on the North Korea piece, on the peace, peninsula peace dimension of this. Again, since I haven't heard a lot of suggestions, does that imply you guys think what we have works pretty well? Steve Began has run a great team and done their best, and they have a working group. Is that enough? Do we, if it's not broke, don't fix it? Or do you have ideas in which you think, given, the new style, the people involved in Biden-Harris, something else is required? And let me just throw in one piece, which again, we haven't brought up. I'm anticipating that the new administration of the United States is going to care a lot more about human rights in a North Korean context than the outgoing one, which was able to pretty much drop that the minute things opened up, the minute the diplomacy opened up. And again, at the kind of personnel as policy level, a lot of people are expecting the special envoy for North Korean human rights to be appointed. Congress, that's an area where they can get very active. You could talk about sanctions. There's human rights basis for the sanctions. And so that's a way for Republicans, if they want to use that issue against it. And frankly, the South Korean government hasn't had to worry about that very much in trying to get diplomacy going again. So how do we need to maybe recalibrate given that new dimension? So thoughts on that, or other last issues you want to get in terms of mechanisms and substance of cooperation? Professor Lee, maybe you, then Dr. Kim, and then Jenny and Frank. We'll finish in that order. So Professor Lee.
네.
Well, yes, now the Korea US cooperations, I would like to mention two things. So, in terms of the North Korea policy between the two countries, there's one issue that they have to coordinate very closely. One is about the simultaneous action, and the other is the step by step approach. Now, the US perhaps, so the US is willing to accept the simultaneous action or the parallel action, but not the step by step approach. So, that was also the official statement by Mr. Began. So that was after the Hanoi summit fell through. But then now for the South Korean government, not just the parallel action, but then also the step-by-step approach as well. So the Korean government believes that the two approaches should be applied to the North Korea relations at the same time, is my thinking. So then, given this backdrop, then for the Biden administration, not just the parallel action, but if the Biden administration also looks into and considers the step-by-step approach as well, then I believe that the Korea-US coordination will work well. So that is one point. Second question about the human rights situation in North Korea. And now recently, Professor Victor Cha, he wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs, and this article also mentions this, that now the arms control negotiations between the US and North Korea must start in the future. So he mentioned that the US and North Korea arms control negotiation, and then he also talked about, he used the expression basket that includes the human rights as well. So I would say that this is like the Helsinki regime or the CSC regime that he had in mind when he used this expression, basket that includes the human rights issues of North Korea. In other words, dealing or handling the North Korean human rights issues as an isolated issue, as a standalone issue, I do not believe that that would be feasible. Now, for this to happen, then a lot of other options have to be on the table, including arms control, to discuss human rights and also conventional weapons or the economic sanctions easing. So I would say that it has to be one of many issues and options on the table. So I would say that, yes, the basket, including human rights. So how we are going to shape or structure this basket, that includes human rights. So I would say that that is also going to be very important in shaping the North Korea policies between Korea and the US.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kim.
예, 저는 그
All right, now then,
한미간 그
for the North Korea policy between the US and Korea, so or the coordination of it, I believe that what we need to consider is for the US, North Korea issues perhaps could be equivalent to addressing the North Korean nuclear issue. But then for South Korea, when it comes to North Korea policy, it has twofold meaning. One is, yes, addressing the nuclear issue. Another is improving the inter-Korea relations. So now then, with that in mind, looking back to the Trump administration, so I believe that we also need to look back to what has been done or not done during the Trump administration. So now under the Trump administration, the North Korea policy became highly dependent to the nuclear issue. So now regarding the working group as well. So for example, the inter-Korea exchanges, they have also become dependent on the US and Korea relations and also became an agenda, part of the agenda between the US and Korea relations. In other words, the US and Korea relations were actually dictating the inter-Korea relations, and the inter-Korea relations became more dependent or more dominated by the US-Korea relations. And that actually was one that actually held back the inter-Korea relations. And as the inter-Korea relations soured, then this actually came back to haunt the US and North Korea relations as well. And overall, it had a negative impact on the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Well, so that is my take on the situation so far. So given this backdrop, then under the Biden administration, this kind of misstep should not be repeated. So under the Biden administration, of course, the US-Korea discussions and dialogue would be very important. But now, in the US and Korea discussion, the agenda has to focus on the North Korean nuclear issue. And then for the inter-Korea relations, it's actually better that the inter-Korea relations not be part of the agenda between the US and Korea discussion. In other words, the North Korea nuclear issue and the North Korea relations issue should be separated from each other. And then also for the Biden administration, I believe that it would be more desirable for all parties involved for the Biden administration to believe that the inter-Korea relations are best left to the parties themselves. And I believe that that could actually improve the US and North Korea relations as well, and also will be more beneficial for building the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So let me reiterate. So under the Biden administration, yes, US-Korea dialogue coordination will be very important, but such dialogue and coordination should be focused more on the North Korean nuclear issue rather than the inter-Korea relations on the whole.
Okay, we're running low on time. Thank you, Dr. Kim. But Jenny and Frank, closing thoughts, like a minute or so, probably. Jenny?
All right, I'll try to be quick. On Dr. Kim's last point here, I think this is important. You know, in 2018, what we had was separate, simultaneous bilateral negotiation processes going on. And essentially what they did was they undercut each other. And so by having this separate, you know, for South Korea to have gone so far forward so quickly, it really undermined any ability to have any sort of collective bargaining power. So for instance, in Hanoi, it would have made sense for you know, North Korea, for the US to have offered exemptions on inter-Korean projects, for instance, as in return for moves on denuclearization. But unfortunately, that's already been promised to North Korea, right? Like they wanted something separate from the US. And so I think there's more that needs to be done at a strategic level of coordination on US ROK approach to North Korea, so that there is an understanding of what the strategy is, what both sides are trying to accomplish, and who's going to be doing what, so that there is some room for that collective bargain. And realistically, too, there's a lot that South Korea wants to do in the inter-Korean process, but needs international cooperation in order to accomplish. And so effectively, a lot of the stuff that South Korea has promised cannot be separated from larger other processes. And so, you know, I think in the Biden administration, obviously there will be a push to restore confidence in the alliances, and so hopefully this kind of strategic level partnership and strategic level consultation will be able to happen.
Okay, great, Jenny. Last word, basically, to you, Frank.
Thank you, John. 4 quick points. First, I think it would be helpful to have the special representative for North Korea policy report directly to the president. I think that will help empower that office, but also give North Korea more confidence that that person has the president's ear. Point 2, we're still not clear whether it's going to be political appointees or career foreign service officers that fill some of these North Korea positions. It could be someone like Began, Victor Cha, Alex Wong, like political appointees, right? Or it could be the Sung Kims, Joseph Yoons, the career foreign service officers. There's been more of a push from the career foreign service officers to have, to draw from within the department to fill these positions to improve the morale of the State Department, right? Point 3, Jong Cho, I think, brought up Helsinki. I think we have to remember from Helsinki that we were able to introduce the human rights basket precisely because we gave the Soviet bloc what they wanted in terms of economic cooperation and the consolidation of their territory. So if we want to apply that model to here, we need to think about giving North Korea exactly what it wants, right? So whether it's on the denuclearization side or somewhere else. Last point, you wanted specific names on people coming in. I'll give you those specific names.
All right.
My personal speculation based on nothing No fact whatsoever, but Frank Januzi, he's someone who has a long relationship with Biden, and he was a former deputy executive director of Amnesty International. That sounds like a great special envoy for North Korean human rights to me, right? Jung Pak, obviously, just because she's, her name's been, identified with part of the campaign. She's a part of the transition team, and she wrote a book on Kim Jong-un. I mean, what more can you ask for there? Also, Yuri Kim, she's the current ambassador to Albania, Korean American, but she was a senior advisor to Blinken when he was deputy secretary. So that's another name to consider if you're looking in-house for someone to fill that position.
Well, Frank, thank you. You stuck the landing, as they say in ice skating. What a great way to it took a couple hours to wear you guys down, but we finally got some names out of this group. A lot of great ideas, and I certainly learned a lot from each of you and from the conversation. So I think we're out of time, but on behalf of our group, thank you to the hosts for doing this, and look forward to seeing everyone in person soon, and stay well, stay healthy.
Hello, this is the Director General Joe. It's good to see all of you after all this time. From the seminar, we were able to hear insight from our experts on North Korea. On my perspective, the Biden administration, there are two things that the Biden administration differs from the past. The first is that he will value the alliance, and second is that he will also value and hear what the experts have to say. And in this perspective, I believe that the great insight that you experts have shared today will be able to build a better and more evolved future of the Korean Peninsula. Again, I thank all of your participation, and I hope for COVID to end soon. And in that time, I hope to see you face to face to again hear your thoughts. Thank you.